Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Lissy Derringer, and I'm privileged to serve as the Development Director here at Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and welcome back to our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. If you don't yet support our work, please do so by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. To moderate today's briefing, it's my honor to introduce Israel Policy Forum's policy advisor, Neri Zilber. Neri's a journalist covering Middle East politics, and he also serves as an adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Neri has been a regular guest on these briefings, as well as on our Israel Policy podcast, where he'll now be serving as host. So stay tuned for new episodes to come. We're also pleased to be joined by David Daoud. David is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and a research analyst at United Against a Nuclear Iran. As always, we encourage you to ask questions of our speakers. Please type your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this broadcast will be published later as an episode of our Israel Policy podcast and published on our website. Again, israelpolicyforum.org. With that, Neri, David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lizzie, for that kind introduction. It's an honor for me to be now more formally associated with an organization that I've long been a fan of, IPF. So it's a pleasure to start off with this event with David. Thank you for joining us today. Everyone's eyes are probably and rightfully fixated on Afghanistan, but on the other side of this region, closer to Israel, is Lebanon. And over the past recent weeks, we've seen a worrying escalation between Hezbollah and Israel, rocket exchanges by Hezbollah into northern Israel, Israeli airstrikes into southern Lebanon, arguably first on both sides since the 2006 war. And really, it's a worrying set of escalatory events. And I'm really pleased to have David to delve into the reasons, as he sees it, for these escalations and rising tensions in the region. But before we delve into the rockets and the airstrikes in particular, bigger picture, David. Lebanon in recent months and perhaps recent years is going through its own version of state collapse. We've seen the currency devalued by, some say, almost 90%. The unemployment and poverty rates are skyrocketing. Immigration is probably the highest it's been maybe since the Civil War in the 70s and 80s. And also you have COVID, that's not going anywhere, neither in Lebanon. So really give us a sense and set the table for us, the background inside Lebanon. What are the conditions now, and really how did that country get to where it's at right now?
Right. So, I mean, as you mentioned, Lebanon is in a process of an ongoing collapse. And, you know, when this really kind of went into overdrive was around October 2019, right? It's in politics almost to say this, but the protests and the kind of the pressure they put on an already crumbling Lebanese system and Lebanese economy really was the catalyst. And then, you know, compound that with COVID, compound that with the Beirut port blast, compound that with, you know, foreign donors cutting off aid because Lebanon, I mean, this goes back to 2018, the Cedar Conference, right? Where donors said, we've given you aid freely before Lebanon, but now we want actual concrete plans for reform, where this money is going to go before we give you a single dime moving forward. So all of these factors kind of going in together, and then you drop the pressure of the protests, the whole thing starts unraveling. So at a most basic level where Lebanon is today, I mean, you know, if we start at the level of the individual, most people have lost their life savings. You know, except for those who've been able to get their money out of the country. Around the time where the protests started, right, people rushed to the banks to get their money out. The banks had implemented these unilateral ad hoc capital controls, but really which were meant to mask the fact that the money was gone. And we'll get into why there and the reasons why Lebanon is this way. So the money, they couldn't take out their dollars. The money that they have, as you mentioned, has become worthless. The Lebanese pound was officially pegged to the lira or to the dollar at 1507 to the dollar, 1507 pounds to the dollar. Now I've seen rates go as high up as 21,000 Lebanese pounds to the dollar. The official rate is still 1507, but really the black market rate seems to be a better gauge of what's going on. Lebanese now, their money is worthless. The price of goods hasn't really gotten cheaper in relation to the price of or to the value of the lira. So now it takes more to purchase basic goods, right? Bread, milk for children, diapers. I read, maybe a year ago now that people were bartering just to get milk for their children. So that's kind of the most basic level. What you've had, if we talk about food, you had an increase of 400% in the price of food between January and December 2020, 400%. Meanwhile, basic goods, the price has risen 455% from November 2019 to July 2021. If we're talking about poverty levels that you mentioned, I think an OCHA report that came out a couple of weeks ago in August noted that out of Lebanon's 5.2 million citizens, we're just talking citizens here, about 78% or 3 million people, give or take, live in poverty. Of those, 1.38 million are living in extreme poverty. And that's aside from the refugee burden that Lebanon has to deal with between Syrians and Palestinians, who are also suffering similarly. And this fiscal crisis is just the tip of the iceberg, because compounded with that, there's a health crisis, there's an electricity crisis, right? Lebanon has had endemic power shortages for God knows how long. And the most critical thing, I think, is the lack of a government. We contrast that with the Israelis, where you have a government that's all colors of the political spectrum at this point, because the country couldn't continue one election cycle after another. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, you had Prime Minister designate Hariri, former Prime Minister designate Hariri, and President Michel Aoun squabbling over whether a cabinet should be 18 or 24 ministers. Now, I contrast that again with Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. One of his electoral promises was to bring down the size of the cabinet, and he gave up on that because he realized there was a greater good at stake. We don't see this in Lebanon. And I think the most recent thing, I think that the most worrying recent development was the beginning of the lifting of subsidies, right? So all this that I just described, the price of food and everything, it was alleviated a little bit and temporarily by central bank subsidies. Central bank seems to have run out of money, and recently they lifted subsidies on fuel. Now, this doesn't just affect your ability to drive your car. I mean, if we go down to even something like drinking water, right? So Lebanon doesn't have a water infrastructure where people can turn on their tap and drink water. So water has to be brought down from the mountains where it's bottled. But that involves transportation costs. That involves, if there's energy for those power plants. All of this is dependent upon fuel. So that transportation, to bring even water into the cities, it's going to make the price of water probably also rise, in addition to the devaluation of the lira at the same time. Lebanon also lacks a public transportation infrastructure. So public buses, trains, what have you. People are heavily dependent to get from one area to another on their cars, to hospitals, whatever, to cabs, right? So if you don't have fuel, driving becomes a luxury. And that's going to affect people's ability to go to a hospital, to go see their relatives, to travel around the country. So that's kind of where we are now. And we can get into numbers if you'd like, but that was just kind of the big picture of where Lebanon is headed. And it doesn't seem like there's any end in sight, right? Najib Mikati and President Aoun today had a meeting. Mikati came out, who's the new prime minister designate, I should say. Mikati came out and said, we'll have a government soon. But when is soon is unclear. Now, if we want to get into how Lebanon got here, now most people will start with the end of the Civil War. I date it back further to the beginning of Lebanon, right? To the very beginning. I think this failure, this collapse is really built into Lebanon's DNA in the sense that Lebanon lacks a real national identity. Lebanon lacks a cohesive purpose. Lebanon initially was built to empower Maronite primacy because they happened once upon a time to be the demographically largest group. Perhaps it was justifiable at that point. As time wore on, that demographic justification was no longer there. Lebanese Muslims, Druze, people who historically may have even had enmity with the Maronites, right? They were all told to share power in this country we call Lebanon. They became the majority, and they became, they started to angle for their piece of the national pie, which they hadn't gotten. Now, compromises were made to kind of, alleviate Maronite hegemony, but really the Maronites set the tone of the country. They got the best jobs in the government. They got the primacy of power, and that had economic power. Sunnis, Druze, they want, eventually when they became the majority, they wanted to reverse this and get their fair share of the pie. This is what resulted in the Lebanese Civil War, right? So when we talk about Lebanon's idyllic years, the first, the years where Lebanon earned the moniker of Paris of the Middle East, really that was a kind of a thin veneer over this volcano that erupted in 1975. So that's the first part. And this lack of a cohesive national purpose, a lack of a cohesive national identity, kind of led to a Lebanese civic engagement that was an inversion of President Kennedy's, what can you do for your country? It became, what can you take from your country? Because the country wasn't meant to serve everyone equally. So why should people serve a country that was meant to just take care of certain people? Now the Lebanese Civil War ended, the Taif Agreement reshuffled the deck, kind of reduced Maronite power, evened things out, but it never healed those sectarian fissures. So now you have a disunity of purpose. Now, when it comes down to even the most basic decisions that have to be made in the government, people are thinking in a zero-sum game of, well, if I approve this, my sect, my tribe, my feudal allegiance even is going to be harmed in exchange for someone who I don't really view as my full countryman in a sense, getting it instead. So there is no unity of purpose. And I think that's what we see now with all this jockeying for positions in the government, right? Because the Maronites have to get their share. The Sunnis have to get their share, and specific types of Sunnis. So this endless squabbling is the result of a lack of a national identity. Now we go into the economic side of things, right? Post-war economic policies really were the foundational crust of what's happening today, particularly the policies of a man who's touted as a Lebanese hero, Rafiq Hariri, right? He's posthumously praised, and I think erroneously, this is a mythologized version of Hariri as an anti-Syrian warrior, as a nationalist. Meanwhile, I mean, he was he came to power because he'd ingratiated himself to the Syrians in the 1980s, and he rebuilt Lebanon's economy as a playground for banking hub and tourism, right? And it was heavily dependent on foreign aid. It was heavily dependent on remittances from Lebanese diaspora. And what he failed to do was revive the Lebanese productive economy, agriculture, manufacturing. Now, these things had accounted for, I think agriculture was 19.7% of the Lebanese economy pre-Civil War, and the industrial sector accounted for 20 to 25% of the Lebanese economy prior to the Civil War. So you have no productive economy, right? And you have a country that's built to be kind of like Singapore, a service-oriented economy, but for a country as unstable as Lebanon, both domestically and in terms of its regional interests. During Hariri's time, also the corruption that we hear about, right? Hariri was a pillar of Pax Syriana, right? He, in order to remain in power, he had to turn a blind eye to Syria skimming money out of foreign aid, to fostering corruption that ended up, enriching Syria, trade policies that benefited Syria at Lebanon's expense. So there's that. Then we move on to the Lebanese Ponzi scheme, which we call the Lebanese economy, right? The Lebanese economy, again, as we mentioned, wasn't productive. And what had developed was a Ponzi scheme, which we can get into details if you want, where basically the central bank would offer high interest rates on deposits from commercial banks. And those commercial banks would offer high interest rates to foreign depositors and to domestic depositors, basically to attract dollars. And they ended up basically loaning to each other until the money ran out, right? Because there's no real money coming in. Lebanon is an heavily importing country. It's not a productive country. And then the final part, I would say, is the fake peg, right? The fake Lebanese lira peg. Now, most countries, Arab countries that have their currency peg, have natural resources, something to justify it, right? Oil, gas. Lebanon has none of this. So this was basically pegged on nothing. And all of this we're seeing now, all of this fiction that Lebanon lived on for 30 years, coming to unravel coupled with the Lebanese having a lack of a cohesive purpose to fix their country. And that's where we're seeing the unraveling. Now, Hezbollah, sorry, go ahead.
No, Hezbollah is a good point of departure for more recent events, and that's a great overview of the economic, political, social, perhaps medical crisis and paralysis that Lebanon currently finds itself. I saw somewhere that it is one of the worst depressions since the 19th century, and I urge everyone that cares about Lebanon, Middle East, and definitely Israel. Just follow foreign journalists and Lebanese themselves posting almost every day on social media, trying to find fuel to power their taxis, trying to live a life with 1 hour of electricity in Beirut. So all of that, you see it on a daily basis, and it's quite worrying. And that's a good departure point for the rocket attacks. So as mentioned at the top, since really May and the early stages of the Israel-Gaza war, we saw rocket attacks from Lebanon into northern Israel. And there have been about 6 such barrages from May till about early August, the last of which was on August 6th. And that one really was Hezbollah. Hezbollah took direct credit for that barrage, but the previous 5 were attributed to this kind of rogue, no-name Palestinian militant group sitting in southern Lebanon. Now, Israel responded primarily via artillery strikes and, in one instance, via airstrikes on southern Lebanon. But the real question coming out of this tit for tat, and we should mention no casualties either on the Israeli side or the Lebanese side. So both sides are careful in their targeting, I would say. But the real question to many minds is, okay, these no-name rogue Palestinian groups are firing rockets. Hezbollah at a certain point felt the need to respond on behalf of Lebanon and southern Lebanon, firing its own rockets. But what's the real relationship between Hezbollah and these Palestinian militant groups in southern Lebanon? Or I'll put it in a slightly different way. Is it credible that Hezbollah had no knowledge or doesn't have any control over these Palestinian groups sitting in southern Lebanon?
Look, I mean, first of all, let's kind of take a historical snapshot. These rockets, and given their timing, aren't unprecedented, right? If we look at previous clashes with Israel and Gaza, be it Cast-led Pillar of Cloud or Protective Edge, there were also rockets fired from Lebanon by unnamed Palestinian groups. The 2 subsequent to, I think there were 2 incidents after the end of the Gaza conflict, this current Gaza conflict, and you can kind of time those to decisions regarding Jerusalem, right? I think one came 2 days after the Sheikh Jarrah, the Israeli Supreme Court case ruling on Sheikh Jarrah, and prior to that, I think there were tensions on the Temple Mount. So the timing, and we see this kind of in the history as well. So it shouldn't come to indicate that Hezbollah is losing control over South Lebanon. I think that's an erroneous narrative. I think it stems from this idea that somehow the protests and everything that's going on in Lebanon has weakened Hezbollah. I think it's constrained it, which is a very distinct thing. I don't think Hezbollah is any weaker today than it is on October 17th, 2019. In the sense that its popular support base hasn't abandoned it to such a level where the group no longer has, legitimacy, if you will, in Lebanon. So I think that's a critical point to be made. Now, does Hezbollah have control over these groups? It's unclear, right? Hezbollah, you're talking about a country where you have a proliferation of arms, where you have anarchy, and Hezbollah contributes to this, obviously, by their very existence. It becomes very hard to control every person with a rocket trying to fire into northern Israel. In past instances, right, I think during Cast-led, the PFLP-GC, excuse me, fired 2 rockets into northern Israel, and that was with Hezbollah's acquiescence. They kind of turned a blind eye. Did this happen with Hezbollah's acquiescence? Perhaps, perhaps it didn't. It's unclear. At the very minimum, what we can say is, again, in a country where you have very little law and order, where you have lawlessness, and a proliferation of arms, it becomes very difficult, even for a group like Hezbollah, to control every action coming out of its territory. We see the same or similar situation with Hamas in Gaza, right? No one would argue that Hamas is losing its grip over Gaza, yet occasionally you have stray rocket fire from unnamed groups or from smaller groups coming out from Gaza into Israel. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does. I think that's the correct official analysis. I think some of us, both here and in other places, observing both Hezbollah and Hamas, raise at least the prospect that Hezbollah and Hamas use these quote unquote renegade groups to have some plausible deniability. But again, that's a thesis that's not proven, and the IDF itself is oftentimes adamant that these are renegade groups that are acting against, say, Hamas or Hezbollah. It remains to be seen. But I should mention that we'd love to get questions from the audience when we finish our conversation. So feel free to send those in. Moving on, Israel, obviously. As I mentioned, both the Israeli government and the Israeli security establishment quite concerned about the rising tensions vis-a-vis Lebanon and these renewed rocket attacks on northern Israel. But in your mind, I mean, taking a step back, there's obviously a new government in Israel, led by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. So in your mind, if things did escalate, what would renewed hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel actually mean for Israel? The subtext is, how bad could it get in your mind?
Sure. I mean, look, I think I want to preface by saying I think the possibility of war remains low, even with the recent rocket strike. I know optically it seems like a big deal. Hezbollah's first time firing into Israel since 2006. At the same time, I think they went out of their way to make sure that it would remain confined and contained. Right? They fired into an area by their own admission that was open territory. Nasrallah even went out of his way to say, like, we planned this to make sure we hit open territory, and they did it in daylight. I think to make sure that even that open territory had no Israeli soldiers or civilians. Nasrallah tried to play this off as concern for wanting to wake up the Lebanese at night, but really I think he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't accidentally kill an Israeli soldier and lead to or an Israeli civilian and lead to an unintended escalation. That to my mind says that despite the optics, Hezbollah really wants to avoid war right now. They just had no choice but to fire in that instance, because Israel also violated one of their red lines. Now, what's this going to look like for Israel? Right, there are multiple scenarios, right? And I think what's commonly discussed is either a multi-front war, right? And this is what the resistance axis, so-called, are threatening, that it would be from Gaza and Syria and different places. Now, let's put that aside. Let's maybe, but let's even take a best case scenario, that it's just a single front war with Hezbollah. We hear a lot about the 150,000 rockets that Hezbollah has amassed since 2006, and this is a big, ominous sounding number, but I think it's important to break down those numbers. So I think the vast majority, even according to Israeli assessments of those numbers, are the short-range Katyusha rockets, right? Low impact, low payload, short-range, inaccurate. Now, according to a 2016 Israeli Home Front assessment, 95% of the rockets Hezbollah will fire in a future conflict with Israel are going to be of the short-range variety. Now, the estimates, the Israeli estimates, I've heard, are something around 1,000 to 1,500 rockets at northern Israel per day. Now, compare that to the 160 rockets that Hezbollah fired at Israel per day on average in the 2006 conflict. Yep, it sounds like a nightmarish scenario, but the reality is a little bit more complex. So Israel has, in the years since, developed Iron Dome. Iron Dome is effective, but it's not a panacea at the same time. Right? There are trade-offs here that Iron Dome can deploy and perhaps mitigate the impact of these 15,000 to 1,500 rockets. But Iron Dome, even on the best day, has an 86 to 90% kill rate. So it's not a hermetic seal over Israeli skies. So rockets will fall. And at the rate of 85 to 90%, what you're talking about is maybe 50 to 200 rockets falling into Israel per day. That's a situation that even with Iron Dome recreates the situation of the Second Lebanon War at minimum. 200 rockets falling into Israel every day. Economically, also Iron Dome becomes prohibitive to deal with each one of these rockets, and that's not accounting for the ones that it will fail to intercept because it'll detect that they're going to fall into open fields. But if you look at each Iron Dome interceptor, they cost somewhere between $100,000, $150,000, if I'm not mistaken, compared to $150 per rocket for Hezbollah, right? So economically, this will have a huge drain on Israel just at the governmental level. Now, 2016 Homefront Command assessment also said that about 1% of these rockets would impact directly inhabited areas or cities. But the problem is beyond just direct harm. As we said, there's the economic toll. And that's not just the economic toll of paying for the Iron Dome interceptors. It's the economic toll of these rockets that might burn forests, right? That might hit bridges, that might hit any infrastructure, even if they don't kill people. There's going to be a lot of economic damage. There's a psychological toll as well, in the sense of, again, 200 rockets impacting in Israel every day. I mean, compare that to Gaza, what happened in May, where I think a similar strategy was used by Hamas to overwhelm Iron Dome. And not that many impacted comparatively, right? It wasn't 100 rockets a day hitting Israel, actually making impact on the ground. There was a huge psychological toll, being in shelters, having to clear the north. And again, the psychological toll, I think, and Hezbollah will doubtlessly play this up in the future conflict, of having humbled the Iron Dome, right? In 2006, it was the theatricality of breaking the Merkava and the strike on the INS Khanit, right? The very theatrical strike. Now, imagine, the psychological impact of having this multi-billion-dollar defense system that still you have hundreds of rockets falling every day into Israel. So that together, and obviously there's the loss of life that could come from these rockets. And I think Hezbollah, as they did in the past, will try to aim for population centers, even with their short-range rockets. So that's just the short-range rockets. Now you have the longer-range rockets, which in theory can target anywhere in Israel. And that can be broken down into two parts, right? The longer range, and I include in that the mid-range, that are unguided, and you have the precision-guided missile threats that everyone's talking about. Now, again, we're talking about problematic numbers in the sense that I think the Zilzal variants that Hezbollah has are about 14,000 rockets that Hezbollah has. Now, in terms of the precision-guided missiles, which are even more worrisome, I think they're the problem. I don't want to say it's been exaggerated, but according to Israeli assessments, Hezbollah only has, right, in December 2018, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu came out and told the Mossad graduating class that Hezbollah had dozens of PGMs at that time, rather than thousands. I think Tamir Haiman at the time, who's the head of Amman, told the Knesset Foreign and Defense Affairs Committee that Hezbollah lacks the domestic ability to produce precision-guided missiles at home. And I haven't seen any updates whether that's changed since then, but to best of my knowledge, that still holds. And then you had the Amman's annual intelligence assessment that came out in February, which still said that Hezbollah has dozens of those rockets. It hasn't expanded the PGMs. It hasn't expanded, to an arsenal that is to the level, say, of the Katyusha threat. Now, there's been what's been talked about is the GPS packages that can be installed on, say, the Zilzals, and turn them from dumb rockets into smart rockets. But even with that assessment, even with that in play, Amman doesn't seem to have changed its assessment as of February 2021. And those are still not tested in battle. Now, at the same time, there's a caveat here, right? Israel thankfully isn't a helpless state, right? It has its means of responding. Now, the kind of the drawback to these, the longer range missiles, they're larger, they're less mobile. Right? The threat from the Katyushas, you can really call it shoot and scoot. You put it on a truck, and before the Air Force or the artillery has the chance to respond, they're gone. The launchers are less mobile. They have much more preparation time, larger heat signatures. Between the Air Force and what's being promised as a ground invasion by the Israeli side, I think they'll be able to contend with that. And I think Israel has made it very clear. And then Israel has also another tier of missile defense when it comes to the longer range rockets, right? David's Sling or Magic Wand. So between, Israel's air superiority in the next war, and I think Israel is making clear that they intend to maintain their air superiority between the acquisition of F-35s, the Galilee Rose, operation or exercise that happened earlier this year, where Israel simulated aerial superiority over Lebanon and Syria, taking into account, Syrian and Russian missile defense systems. This seems to be still a mainstay of IAF and IDF doctrine. So what we could see to deal with this missile threat, not just the defensive capabilities, but also something like a repeat of Mishgal Skouli in 2006, where the IDF or the IAF launched a 34-minute blitz, they say, that took out most of the mid to long-range rockets. Now, that's the missile threat. Then you have another component, which is the ground forces, Hezbollah ground forces threat. Now, the experience in Syria has given Hezbollah's fighters a lot more battle experience, combat experience. Now, at the same time, Hezbollah's lost a lot of veteran fighters and commanders. So there's a trade-off here. So this makes them a much more formidable force, I think, for when the Israelis move into Lebanon. Now, that's, I think, where the crux of that threat is going to be. I think, Hezbollah's leaders for about 10 years now have been threatening that in a future war, they're going to invade the Galilee. I think that's very unlikely in the sense of a genuine classical invasion. Right? It would expose Hezbollah's fighters to the full brunt of the IDF standoff firepower. They'd have to have static supply lines that could be easily cut off. I mean, it would be, they would be eliminating all of their strengths as a guerrilla force and exposing themselves to the full brunt of the IDF without having a counter. Hezbollah doesn't have tanks, planes, artillery to counter Israel's. So what I think we'd see there is more likely an attempt to catch the IDF off guard as it's moving into Lebanon, or maybe as it's contending with different fronts, and move into border towns, maybe Metula, maybe a couple of kibbutzim or moshavim on the north, kidnap civilians or soldiers, take people hostage, kill people, cause destruction, and having that all filmed. Maybe not the destruction or the murder part, but having the operation of entering Israeli territory filmed, planting a Hezbollah flag on Israeli soil, and think of the impact that would have on Israeli morale to see that Israel's territory is no longer inviolable, that Hezbollah can reach inside. Now, it's mostly theatrics, right? It has a danger. It has a danger to the civilians, but it's not. There's no threat, I think, of losing the Galilee to a Hezbollah force or to a resistance axis force, but it will erode Israeli public morale. It could increase pressure on the government to end a future conflict. So that I think is kind of the 50,000 foot view where I think that the impact is going to be on Israel in the future war.
That's a great military analysis. I liked, at least at the start, that you were more the voice of calm and the voice of reason, which is always nice to hear. To put it in context for the viewers, as David mentioned, in the Gaza war in May, it was an 11-day conflict. Hamas fired about 4,000 rockets at Israel. The IDF's latest assessment is that in one day, with the conflict with Hezbollah, they could very likely fire 4,000 in just one day. Now, as David mentioned, it doesn't mean that all of them will land. There's obviously Iron Dome and the Israeli Air Force and potentially ground forces trying to suppress that rocket fire. But as we saw in 2006 and in multiple Gaza campaigns, it's very, very hard to suppress such rocket fire, especially when these rockets are oftentimes hidden and fired from civilian installations, schools, mosques, and the like. So not an easy scenario at all. But hopefully David is right. Hopefully it won't get to that. I'd like to zoom out a little bit. There's obviously a wider regional, if not international, context to the recent uptick in rocket fire and tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. We've seen the nuclear talks between the Biden administration and Iran kind of stall out. We've seen tankers get hit in the Persian Gulf, either by mines or more recently by a drone. We've seen a new hardline government take power in Tehran. So really this kind of consolidation by the more hardline elements in Iran of almost every facet of government control. We know that Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. So what, in your mind, is the Iranian role in all this, if at all?
I mean, I think obviously in anything Hezbollah does, virtually anything at the top level, Iran is at least consulted. I think Hezbollah is more properly considered an extension of Iran rather than a proxy state like Hamas, right? There's much more, the ties that bind Hezbollah to Iran are much stronger than, say, the ones that bind Hamas to Iran. Given that, I think a situation, right, where like the rockets that were fired into Israel, Iran at the same time gives its proxies and its extensions a lot of leeway to assess the situation on the ground. What are their needs? What are the challenges they're going through? They're not going to push them into a point where they might take a counterproductive action. Say, for example, Hezbollah launching a war with Israel now, right? I think it would be premature for Iran to do so, absent an existential threat to Iran, absent something that was very overriding. Right now, there would be no benefit. And Iran would harm its investment in Lebanon, the missiles they've built up, the force they've trained Hezbollah, without kind of an any equal benefit coming from war. So what I think, I don't think it's coincidence, that this rocket strike was so meticulously planned, again, to avoid casualties. I think there was probably consultations with the Iranians who probably said, given the optics of this, it has to be meticulously planned to avoid Israeli casualties. Now, what we do see at the same time, though, is an increasingly bolder Iran in the region. As you said, the attacks on the tankers. So, to me, this is a response to kind of a more lax or a softer U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, and kind of a reorientation when it comes to our allies. So with the new Biden administration coming in, obviously the rhetoric has been tamped down from the previous Trump administration. One of the first moves the Biden administration made was to delist the Houthis, key Iranian proxy, as an FTO, pulling support for the Saudi war in Yemen, pulling weapons, reassessing the weapons we're going to sell to Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. Lack of the same type of emphasis, say, on the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration had. So we see kind of a United States taking a softer approach to Iranians. At the same time, right? If you look at the timeline of these events, the strikes on the tankers, the increased Iranian harassment, kind of coincides with these softening U.S. moves. We are seeing an emboldened Iran. We are seeing, an Iran that I think the recent conflict in Gaza wouldn't have happened had it not been for an Iranian green light. It's simply that seems to be the one factor, rather than Sheikh Jarrah, rather than the issues on the Temple Mount. Right, these have happened before, and we've never seen Hamas threaten and then carry out a threat to fire rockets at Jerusalem, which they knew it would be a cause of war. To me, I place that in the context of kind of this shadow war that was going on between Iran and Israel. The Iranians would strike the Israelis have been striking Iranian assets, Iranian proxy assets in Syria and in Iran for a very long time. The Iranians started responding recently to the tankers, or against tankers, and then, kind of this escalation, right? This was kind of the tit for tat, in the sense that Iran's response came from Gaza. Iran's response activated Gaza against Israel. So there is that element. But that doesn't mean that where Iran is, say, willing to take a risk in Gaza, it's going to necessarily be willing to take the same risk at the moment in Lebanon. I think there's a different assessment they're conducting there, because Lebanon, right now, if the Israelis were to launch a war, there's no going back, in the sense that what Israel is promising is the most destructive conflict for Lebanon, period. There's no one to rebuild. Where Lebanon is now, it would be much worse. And for Hezbollah, Iran's investment to continue growing, it has a symbiosis with Lebanese stability, in the sense that no entity can grow in a situation where there's chaos, where there's civil war, where there's, again, where there's an aftermath of a very destructive war. So I think for now, they're going to calm the situation or keep the situation on a low burner with Lebanon, rather than escalate into a full conflict.
Okay. once again, a voice of calm. I like this. You're settling my nerves. So this is the final question before we get into the audience questions that were submitted. Brass tacks, right? Is there anything the Biden administration can do to weaken Hezbollah and to help the Lebanese people, given the near state collapse? We know that aid is still going to the Lebanese armed forces. And also, you mentioned the Abraham Accords. We've seen a convergence of interest between Israel and various moderate Sunni Arab states in the region. Is there a role for these Arab states as well in Lebanon, as they have done in the past, or in your opinion, have they completely washed their hands of the Lebanon quagmire?
Look, I think, you mentioned at the outset of this that attention is focused on Afghanistan, and rightly so. And I think one of the big lessons from Afghanistan is that there's only so much the United States can do, even if we apply, 2 decades of military and economic investment in the country. There are limitations to even what the United States is capable of. If we apply this to Lebanon, I think we are seeing the limitations. We've pumped billions of dollars of aid into NGOs, into the LAF, and all we've seen is a worsening of the situation. Right? We haven't seen economic reform. We haven't seen a strengthening of kind of civil society in such a sense that it can counter the feudal patronage systems that exist in Lebanon, of which Hezbollah is one. We haven't seen the LAF act effectively in any sense against Hezbollah. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation to begin with. So there is a limit to what we can achieve. And I think any assessment we have of what we should do with Lebanon must start there, that perhaps we have reached the end of what we can achieve in Lebanon. Now, moving forward, it's easier to kind of leave things there. Moving forward, I think continued aid to Lebanon must be predicated on accountability, results, right? For so long, part of the problem has been that the international community, the United States, will give aid to Lebanon without any commensurate reform, without any commensurate change on the metrics that we need to see changed. Corruption, building proper infrastructure, terrorist organizations. So moving forward, I think from both the Lebanese government, we need to see tangible reform. And in response to that tangible reform, the United States should give a proportionate amount of aid. And as the reform increases, perhaps more proportionate aid. When it comes to the LAF, and these things obviously exist together, right? When it comes to the LAF, it's the same thing. We need to see that the LAF is actually implementing 1701, if that's even possible, is actually moving to curtail or constrain Hezbollah's military, social, political growth. If we don't see that, then aid isn't given freely. Aid can't be given freely. And the primary burden here, though, remains on the Lebanese themselves to pull their country out of the mess. They brought it into. Once we see credible movement from the Lebanese, and I'm not just talking about masses of unguided people in the street, as much as our hearts go out to them and what they want. Protests don't build countries. Protests aren't an organized political program to save a country. And what we've seen, again, out of 2 years of protests is very little in terms of actual results, in terms of changing the political class. So without that, we can't step in to aid in concrete and specific ways, because our aid would just be useless at that point. And if anything, it would actually be counterproductive in that we would give the ruling oligarchy in Lebanon more time, a longer lease on life to continue dragging the country into the direction they've been dragging it in. Now, part of this also is what we do with Iran, right? If we're speaking specifically about the Hezbollah threat. Accountability, again, if we are going to enter a JCPOA 2.0, then we need to see movement on the militias. This is the real threat that Iran poses to the region right now. The nuclear missile threat, as nightmarish as that is, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon right now. Right. So the real threat, even without a nuclear weapon, we've seen the chaos that Iran can sow around the region, the destabilization. So if Iran is unwilling, and it might not be willing, it's very improbable that Iran would be willing to abandon its proxies or to roll back that. That's its main form of projection, power projection in the region. But absent that, we should not move to make Iran's ability to digest the region easier. And part of this, we also have to come to, I think, face reality that we can't necessarily change Iran's behavior. We can give Iran all the concessions in the world, it might not change. Part of this is also to realize that we might be able to pump all of our energies into certain countries where Iran kind of has the upper hand, be it Lebanon or Syria or Iraq, and we might not be able to pull them back from the brink. So what this requires us to do, again, not to cut deals with Iran and just accept that situation, but what it requires us to do, and this comes to the Abraham Accords and what the Sunni powers in Israel can do, I think it requires the United States to help consolidate the assets it does have in the region, rather than focusing on the potentials and the unattainables. We do have allies in the region. And the Trump administration, whether advertently or not, I think left an architecture, the basic building blocks in place for, if the Iranians have a resistance axis, for an anti-resistance axis centering around, Israel and the Gulf states. The United States, has been, under the Biden administration, has been putting a lot more emphasis on, say, reaching a deal with Iran, withdrawal from Afghanistan. These are important priorities, but I think it needs to go back to broadening and widening the Abraham Accords to at least contain any more Iranian destabilization in the region, even if we can't roll it back in those countries like like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. As for the role of Sunni states in Lebanon, I think they have washed their hands, and I think their ability to actually affect change is probably more constrained than ours, and they realize that. I don't see them stepping back into the breach the way they did before, and even if they did, I'm not sure what the outcomes would be, or how the outcomes would differ than when they were pumping billions of aid into Lebanon.
Okay, thank you for that. Slightly less optimistic.
Yeah.
So we're gonna open up the Q&A. We have one from Ari Engel. It's a good question. Given what we've seen over the past few days in Afghanistan, do you envision a Taliban type takeover of Lebanon by Hezbollah, or are the sectarian divisions and the makeup of Lebanon so precise and so strong that it would be really just a civil war and not truly come to that point? Essentially, how strong is Hezbollah inside Lebanon vis-a-vis all the other sects, the Sunnis, Druze, Maronites, and the like?
Look, I think this goes back to what I said earlier, that Hezbollah prefers stability to chaos, because its main goal is to grow, right? To grow its political, military, and social power. Eventually, down the road, do they want to take over Lebanon? They have said they want an Islamic republic in Lebanon akin to the one in Iran. But that seems to be kind of an organic process they envision happening. Now, that being said, I think they prefer not to. They prefer not to have to, expand because go take over these broader areas. You have to expand your social services networks. It's not just, there's a bigger responsibility that comes with it. And I don't think Hezbollah wants that burden at the moment. Now, push come to shove, right? If Hezbollah's back is against the wall, we don't need to get into hypotheticals. We saw what they did in Syria, right? Where they, where a critical ally of theirs would have fallen, cutting off their aid route to Iran potentially, because you don't know the outcome of that war if a friendly regime would come into place. And Hezbollah, along with Iran, burned the country to the ground, murdered countless Syrians to ensure that its hegemony, its lifeline would not be cut off, and that Iran's hegemony in the region would not be harmed. Beyond that, I think what you could see in Lebanon, right, is again another replication of what the Iranian axis did in Syria, which is not just Hezbollah fighting, but if push comes to shove, they could bring in the same kind of array of forces that they brought to bear in Syria: Iraqis, Afghanis, Pakistanis, even some Nigerians, right?
Right.
The resistance axis as a whole would come to shore up Hezbollah in Lebanon, but I don't think they're going to initiate if that's what the question is.
Okay, that's also quite good to know. We have a question here from Lester Freundlich. Essentially, in your opinion, how good do you think Israeli intelligence is inside Lebanon in terms of Hezbollah's military buildup? From what you've seen, do you see that they have a good grasp of what's going on there in terms of what's coming out, or is it they're not showing their entire hand? I have some thoughts on this, but I'd like to get your thoughts as well.
That's I don't know if that's a question I'm in any position to answer. Look, I think what we've seen is a target bank that continues to expand. What we've also seen in the past is Israeli overconfidence when it comes to intelligence coming out of Lebanon, where if we go back to the 1980s and kind of the blinders that Israel went into Lebanon with, right, this idea of Maronite primacy and going to support Bashir Gemayel and the outcomes of that, we've seen that even with great intelligence capability, with so-called Lebanese partners on the ground, Israeli intelligence can be very off. Now, I would hope that in the decades since, Israeli intelligence has kind of learned the mistakes that they made, during the 1980s and rectifying that. But in terms of them showing their whole hand, I would venture to say they're not showing their whole hand, just as a matter of common sense that no intelligence organization is going to divulge everything. But in terms of just brass tacks, from the target bank on the ground, it seems like Israel is at least trying to do its homework, taken at face value. Again, a lot of caveats, but
no, I think your point about perhaps intelligence hubris or overstretch by Israel and others in the Middle East is worth keeping in mind, especially given recent events elsewhere in the region. Mm-hmm. In terms of Israeli intelligence capabilities, and I'd broaden this question out to Israeli military capabilities, they've gotten much better in recent years, and especially since the last Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006. So you speak to senior Israeli officials and military commanders. I don't think it's just bluster when they say that the IDF of 2021 is vastly more improved and more capable and more lethal than the IDF of 2006. And we should say a lot more prepared for an escalation in Lebanon, which arguably the IDF was not when Hezbollah crossed the border and kidnapped and killed several Israeli soldiers, sparking that month-long war in the summer of 2006. So I don't think it's just bluster when they say this. I think their target bank, as you say, is quite robust. I think that's similar to what we've seen in previous campaigns in Gaza. And I think the real question is, if things were to escalate, the better question might be in terms of policy, right? So we know the IDF has the capabilities and they can call up reserves and bring the necessary force to bear on southern Lebanon, on Hezbollah and beyond. But I think in terms of policy, it'll be a very interesting dilemma, let's say, especially for this new Israeli government, how far they want to push it. You mentioned that a ground offensive has been promised in the past. In terms of any renewed escalation with Hezbollah, that's easier said than done in terms of calling up the reserves and launching a ground campaign into southern Lebanon, as opposed to what we've seen in Gaza in recent years, which is primarily more an air campaign, which is a lot. The costs of that are much less than going in on the ground. So I think it's more a policy question than a real kind of military capability question. We have another question. Okay, on a similar topic, how good is Hezbollah's intelligence division? In other words, from your point of view, how well does Hezbollah understand Israel, and how precise is its intelligence in terms of either ground or rocket attacks on Israel?
Look, I think that's first of all, I'd like to say that, yeah, I agree with everything you said on Israel's improved military capabilities. I mean, 2006 was a low bar. And you can see that the Israelis have kind of had a laser focus since then on improving capabilities vis-a-vis Lebanon. As for Hezbollah's intelligence capabilities, now look, Hezbollah has networks to gather intelligence from information. Right? You have the drug smuggling that we so often hear about, criminal networks. Now Hezbollah has tapped into these, and we've had reports in the past of Shin Bet capturing people who are transferring information to Hezbollah. What does this translate into? That's a better question, right? Some of the videos they've put out recently of kind of targets, their target bank, their equivalent to the target bank. To me, I dismiss that as propaganda mostly. Most of this stuff can be found on Google Maps, Google Earth. Does anyone still use Google Earth? So it's meant to kind of scare the Israeli populace and boast to their own population. Oh, look at what we're capable of doing. That doesn't mean they don't have any knowledge of what's going on in Israel, any understanding. Again, they have networks in Arab Israeli community, probably within the criminal families. They have, Unit 133 operates in the West Bank. They are gathering intelligence. Now, how much they understand Israeli society. Now, I think that's a more complicated question. There are, I'm sure, units within Hezbollah meant to understand the enemy. It's a critical point. We have seen that in past conflicts with Israel, they had a keen understanding of what Israeli society, how far it was willing to go. Say the South Lebanon conflict, they understood that the target, right? And this is 1985 to 2000. They understood that confronting the IDF one-on-one would have meant certain destruction for Hezbollah. There's no parity. So rather than kind of hit the IDF face on, they tailored their attacks to strike at the soft underbelly, which is Israeli public opinion, which they knew was ambivalent and had been ambivalent about involvement in Lebanon since 1982. So there is that. At the same time, we have statements by Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah's political echelon that the Israelis are weak cowards, that every Israeli has a bag packed and a second passport ready to abandon Israel at the drop of a hat. And I think, I hope that's their understanding of Israeli society, because it's entirely erroneous. So if that is, that could be, there's two ways to look at this. It's propaganda for their base, that, Israeli society is weak. Just give us a little bit more time, guys. We'll get rid of them. But if it reflects an actual understanding, the actual understanding of Hezbollah, of Israeli society and Israeli attachment to the land and to Israel, then I think they are completely off base, and then their understanding of Israeli society is a lot faultier than previous instances would suggest, previous conflicts would suggest.
Right. We also we should remember that after the 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war, Nasrallah came out and essentially said, if I knew that the response was going to be as severe as it was going to be, then I probably wouldn't have tried to cross the border and kidnap those Israeli soldiers. And he's been essentially living in a bunker for the past 15 years. So that's also, I think, indicative of where they are. It doesn't mean miscalculations can't happen, sure, especially in this part of the world, but it, I think, is telling that despite the bluster and despite the propaganda and despite the messaging, they may be a bit more cautious than all of that may imply. David, do you have any concluding remarks before we sign off? I mean, I think in terms of the conditions in Lebanon and the tensions vis-a-vis Israel, I think you laid it out quite well. Do you, and especially given what we've seen now in Afghanistan, right? That state collapse can happen quite quickly. Are you more optimistic, more optimistic, more pessimistic, or pretty much the same as you were, let's say, this time last week?
I mean, look, I think someone once described me as cautiously pessimistic, and I think that's my constant. Look, I think the situation, like I said, in Lebanon, I don't think we've seen the end of it in terms of how bad it will get. At the same time, if we're talking about specifically the effect on Israel, I think that Israel just needs to learn the mistakes of its past. Don't get involved in a Lebanese conflict, an internal Lebanese conflict. Don't take sides. And the impact of whatever will happen, Israel can mitigate on itself just through that. I think there's even talk of building a border wall on the north, right? They're looking for the budget. So I think that'll be a good mitigating measure. And just, in general, understanding the Hezbollah threat as it is, not 10 feet tall, but also not this narrative that's been building up for 2 years that Hezbollah is, become so weakened, and that it is one, Lebanese protest away from dissolution. This is an entity, again, that's part of a broader axis that we saw in Syria would rather rule over rubble than concede any power. So we haven't seen the end of Hezbollah. At the same time, I think they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot. They are a very pragmatic organization after all. So there are pros and cons here, but it's manageable.
it's a complicated region, and I don't think there's a more complicated country than Lebanon. And this is coming from somebody who sits in Israel. David, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us your time. Thank you all who joined us as well. I'd like to thank IPF supporters who were on today's call. Your generosity makes programs like this and everything else possible. And if you haven't yet done so, please consider making a contribution at www.israelpolicyforum.org/support. Listen to our upcoming podcasts, Israel Policy Pad. Sign up to receive our weekly Koplo column from our policy director, Michael Koplo, and visit our website. Stay tuned for further announcements about future programs. Until then, thanks again, David, and thanks again to you all for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.